Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders.
Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people.
Hey there guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres.
And I'm Sage from Terra Nova Acres, and we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today we're going to be talking about long-term goals and the delayed gratification of homesteading. But before we get into the topic, what did you get up to this week, Sage?
I've still been sick this week, and I was thinking about it earlier. I was like, man, why do I just feel so behind on life? And I was like, okay, right, I've been sick for over a week to the point that it's affected what I can get done. Before that, I was just fried. I was so burned out because of all of the stress from the storm. And then before that was the storm itself. And all of those things have kind of derailed my productivity for the last essentially almost 2 months now. And so I'm like, right, okay. Yeah, that's why I feel behind on life. But I'm finally starting to feel better and finally starting to get back to a place of better productivity. Not back to normal, but at least better. So now I'm starting to think about things like, all right, it's kind of time to plan for next year, even though we just got through this year, more or less. You know, when we're recording this, it's middle of November. And so daylight savings has hit. It gets dark at like 6. There's just not a lot of time to do things outside, but there is a lot of time to sit inside and think about, master plans for next year. So that combined with looking at the decent potential for some really significant price hikes on everything next year, I've started to contemplate, like, maybe this is the time to just say, screw it, I need to build a high tunnel. And not a massive one, not a high-tech one, but something that would allow me to have better food productivity through the colder seasons, and also have better protection for my tomatoes for the things like blight and the funguses that we deal with so much in this region. So looking at what infrastructure I want to take advantage of in the season when I'm not really growing things, and then also starting to make plans for seed shopping, figuring out what I saved seed from, what I have enough left over from last year that should also have decent germination rates in the next year, figuring out the varieties that I want to swap out because I didn't like what I grew last year. All of that kind of stuff. And it's very much in the brainstorming phase at the moment. I'm not executing anything. I'm just thinking.
Yeah, I am usually like very on top of that whole planning phase thing come end of garden season. And this year it's just not happening yet, and I'm like, I really need to get into that headspace. I feel like I'm still lingering with house project things and fall things, and I'm like, I need to really go through my seeds and figure out what I need to buy, because I am a little bit nervous that we're going to have the same situation that we did in 2020 when it comes to buying seeds. And by that I mean I'm not going to be able to buy them because they're going to be out of stock. So I need to get on that and figure out what I need.
Oh, and I forgot about this, but I pre-ordered my chicks for meat birds for next year. It's another planning thing, another thing to check off on the list. But I was disappointed. So usually I get the Cornish roaster from McMurray, which is a Cornish cross, but they have different kinds of Cornish cross, and some of them grow really fast, and some of them grow fast, but not freakishly fast. And that's what I usually get. I usually get the one that takes like 8-ish weeks not the one that takes 6-ish weeks. But they don't have it anymore. They don't have it this year for some reason. And so I am getting a different kind than I'll say usually. I've switched it up every year, but I was going to reorder that one, and that was going to be my usual bird, but had to switch that one up. And I did not order from McMurray this year. I ordered from a more local hatchery, so we'll see how that goes. What about you? What were you up to this week?
I've kind of been in lingering house project mode with trying to catch up on fall things and stuff we weren't able to get done before our friends came and then the hurricane and everything. Taylor has been working on flooring and some of the other house projects still. I have been focused on painting all of the things. So I painted what little trim we have in the house, which is just windows. I've painted the living room, and that's like a huge process because they're really old windows and they're really gross and dirty and filled with spiders and bugs and things. So that was the whole thing. I got those painted. They matched the living room walls, which I'm really excited about. It's like completely color drenched in there. And I've also been painting 2 IKEA bookcases that we just got to install as like built-ins, and we're gonna like trim them in and everything once we get to the trim part. Those are completely taking over my basement right now. Like every single piece has to be painted multiple times and primed multiple times. My entire basement is half green bookcase chunks. And then like lingering fall things. We finished cider this week. We finished pressing the cider. I still have a bushel of apples to process. I think I probably mentioned that last week. We got a whole bunch more mulch and logs dropped off. They keep bringing them. Like, we got more today. So we have piles and piles. We probably have like enough firewood for 3 years now. I prepped my garlic beds this weekend, and I was planning to plant them, but it started raining on Sunday, so I wasn't able to. So outside things right now are only weekend things because it gets dark so early. And when I get done with work, it's already getting dark outside. So I'll be planting that next weekend. We had a chicken die again, and this was a completely different reason, and I still don't know for sure what happened, but Taylor was out there hanging out with our ducks and like checking on them, and he said that like it happened all of a sudden where he thinks we have a second rooster that we got on accident again in February with our little batch of chicks. And he's a Brahma, so he's really, really big, and he jumped on one of our normal size hens, and now that he's like almost getting closer to being a full size chicken, he's massive already. We think he just like crushed her, like broke her neck or her back, and she died like instantly. So we had to deal with that. That was pretty upsetting. So we separated him, and he's not going to be with the flock any longer, which is a bummer because he's actually like, the roosters get along okay, and he's actually really good with everyone, but I think he's just too big. I've been trying to do things that don't require me to be on camera this week because I have not been in the mood to be on camera this week. I've been kind of just like in my feelings. It's been like a really tumultuous week for our country, and I'm just like, there's a lot of feelings and thoughts going through my head this week, and I'm kind of having a hard time wanting to be able to film anything. And so I've been doing the tasks that I feel like I either don't need to talk to the camera or be on camera at all. And yeah, I've just been in that headspace where I'm like, I really need to film things. I really want to get stuff out because November and December are like the highest yielding months of the year for revenue. And I'm like, I don't want to just skip November because that helps me pay for my bills. So trying to force myself to like keep pushing through things, keep working on renovation projects, and I'm just not feeling it at all this week, to be completely honest. But that's where I'm at. All sorts of stuff going on like usual, but not really super motivated at the same time. So yeah, the topic of this episode is actually, I think, something that has pulled me out of that headspace a little bit, getting into the process of thinking about goals for next year, goals for what's ahead of us, and kind of reflecting on all of the work we've put in so far. I'm ready for that season to be in full swing. So I'm excited to talk about this tonight.
Yeah, honestly, homesteading and planning is much more a game of chess than it is checkers. And although I had some concept of that, the long-term sight that you have to have and the amount of planning that really does go into it. I had some concept of that before I was in it and when I started. But now that I'm heading into year 4 and things are starting to build on each other, right? I've been able to build momentum in some places and some things are kind of done and I can move on to other things. I'm noticing it more and more, the amount of foresight that you really do have to intentionally have going into this. I mean, I guess you could do it chaos method, but that would drive me crazy. I would not be mentally sound if that was my tactic.
I like to go in both lanes there, where I'm like, I really, really have to plan ahead if I want to be able to get anything done because of money, but also because of like my ADHD is like, okay, well, we could do this project, this project, this project, and 17 other ones, but realistically, like I could get 1 or 2 projects done. And if I don't plan ahead, a lot of the stuff that we're doing is so seasonal that like I have to wait a whole nother year if I don't plan ahead and I think about it too late. So I'm with you on that. Like I would go crazy if I didn't plan anything. I love planning. I feel like I've said this so many times. Like a lot of things do not go to plan, but having some sort of plan and having it in your brain, like even if it's at the back of your brain, it's super beneficial. I think also for me, like in this season of life, I also have house projects happening. That has kind of fed into my desire to get instant gratification a little bit more, where like I can be patient on the homestead projects because I'm getting more of that instant gratification from house projects that I'm working on. Because like I can paint, like a whole room in 2 nights or 1 night, and I can see the change immediately. But there is still like a whole bunch of waiting with that process, and there's gonna be continuous waiting until we're done, which we may never be done. So I think it's like the ebb and flow of the house projects right now are giving me instant gratification, a lot of them. In the future, now that I've built up all of the garden and animal things, and like as we build our homestead, it'll be more of a sense of instant gratification, even though I've waited years for it, it'll be like finally getting to feel the excitement of all of that coming to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at growing your own food, you don't reap the harvest the same day that you sow the seed. You actually usually don't even reap the harvest in the same 3 months that you sow the seed. And to be able to have that level of not only patience, but consistency. All of these things take consistent care. And maybe you'll get lucky if you have to neglect things. Maybe some things will pull through, but when you're doing things like raising meat birds, you have to feed them every day. When you're doing things like starting tomato seedlings, if you forget them under the lights and they dry out, they might not make it. And so it's not only the amount of time that passes between the initial investment and the reward, but it's also the amount of investment that's consistent throughout that.
Also, a factor in this is that there's no guarantee that anything's going to work out. I think a lot of other like hobbies and activities that people do, there's like almost a guaranteed sense of gratification where like, if you're gonna take up knitting, that at the end you're gonna have something. It might not be perfect. You're gonna have something physical to show for it though. But like your seedlings might die. The plants might not produce anything even if you do get them to seedlings, or maybe you get a hurricane and everything gets flooded and then, you don't have the plants anymore and it's too late to replant something. Or your animal has health issues or it dies. The recipe that you tried to make for the first time with all of your homegrown food that you've spent months growing and picking and preserving and starting from seeds and thinking about the seeds a year before that? What if that recipe turns out and it tastes bad? Like, what do you do then? You're going to wait another year to try a new version of that recipe. That's what you're going to do. And still then, there's not a guarantee that it's going to taste good. So I think that's something I think about a lot. I'm like, I'm doing this and I'm trusting that not only is nature going to pull through for me, but I'm going to pull through for me, and I'm going to like take the responsibility and determination to take care of something for months or years on end, depending what it is. We're so used to instant gratification. A lot of people just rely on getting something almost immediately. I'm curious, when you think of instant gratification, what do you think of? What comes to mind first?
That's a good question. I don't feel like, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't feel like there are a lot of things in my life that are instantly gratifying. Like, I make my meals mostly from scratch. I grow a lot of my own food. I mean, I've been in sheep for 2 years and am maybe possibly only gonna start getting milk next year. My favorite things, the things that I center my life around, take time, and I almost feel like that's why I enjoy them, because in my opinion, and this might be a little conceited, but it's not worth it to most people. Most people will not spend time researching things like seed varieties and flower varieties and starting them from seed, transplanting them out, growing them just to get a bouquet. That's kind of why I like it. Now, I do also recognize that I live in the 21st century, and a lot of things around me kind of are automated. And those things are so integrated into my life, and for the most part have always been, that I don't even see it anymore. It's not like I'm in the 18th century and I'm living without power and all that kind of stuff. So like I know that they're in my life, but at the same time, I feel like in a lot of ways, I choose the long way around.
That's really fair. I think that when you choose to kind of embrace homesteading, regardless of how you choose to embrace it, there's some essence of going against the norm. It's countercultural, no matter how popular it's gotten. You're choosing to take the slow way for a lot of things, whether that's starting your own seeds or going to the nursery to buy seedlings. Those are both the slow way to do things, because you could just go to the produce aisle, right? And I think that's why, at least for me, that's a huge reason that the food tastes so good. It's not the actual, I mean, it is the taste of the food, but it's not just the taste of the food, it's the story behind it. And it's taking a bite of something that you put on your plate, but before that, it got preserved and put in a jar. It got picked out of your garden in the summer sunshine. It got planted in the garden months before that, and it got started in your basement on a seed starting shelf months before that. And you got seeds from somewhere even like longer before that, and you were thinking about it before you even bought the seeds. So the story behind it is a huge deal to me.
Okay, so then let me turn the tables and ask you that same question about instant gratification.
My answer is different for my life versus what I think of, because I also feel like I embrace the like more slow way of doing things, but I also expect my paycheck to be in my bank account on the 1st or the 15th of every month. And if it doesn't, I'm like, where is it? Like, this should be in here. I need to pay bills. I expect my washer to finish in the time that it says it's going to, and to be able to put it in my dryer when I'm doing laundry. I expect the mail delivery person, the USPS person, to show up on a fairly regular basis and deliver mail to me. I expect my trash service to come pick up my trash. Those aren't like gratification things, but they are things that, like, in our society, it's something that's consistent and we expect it to be happening on a regular basis. And I feel like sometimes we take those things for granted. If I were thinking about generally society, instant gratification, I immediately think of Amazon Prime, which is something that I'm going to be canceling this year because I don't have like an issue with buying things. Like I'm fine if I don't buy things. It is nice to have, it's convenient, but a huge goal for me this year is to be less convenient with things, making myself more uncomfortable with that process, especially with certain companies, and Amazon's one of them. So I also think of takeout or fast food, which, again, not necessarily a bad thing if you don't abuse it. I think of Netflix and streaming services, the produce aisle, like I said earlier, getting strawberries in January, Easy Mac, instant mashed potatoes. Like there's so many things that are just designed to give us instant gratification. And I would say the one that's probably the biggest and most relevant, obvious one that I've noticed in the last handful of years is the appearance of short form content on social media.
Absolutely. And okay, so that is one. The short form content is absolutely an instant gratification that I seek out in my life. I totally get that. Part of that is I love collecting random little bits of information. It makes my brain so happy. I just feel like a squirrel hiding acorns, right? But it's my brain with random information that I'll probably never use again in my life. But yeah, I'm totally a sucker for short form content, without a doubt.
I feel like I've gotten more into it recently, especially this week. But honestly, I am so very much a person who likes to have some form of audio content playing while I'm working on a hobby or a project or a task or work. Like all of the time, I like to have something playing in the background that also keeps my mind busy. It's kind of like Lindsay talked about. She likes to have something on in the background while she's planting things or sewing, and it just makes things go quickly, and it keeps my mind from wandering too much because it's focused on multiple things already. So usually that's YouTube or music or a podcast or an audiobook. Something that I kind of started doing earlier this year, was whenever I'm doing like dishes or something or in the kitchen, I will open up Instagram or whatever. It's usually Instagram for me. And I'll just like tap on the stories and let them play through. Like I'll have my audio on, but then it switches to the next one immediately as soon as that one's done. Like it will switch to the next person's story. However, if you're on Reels or TikTok or Shorts or whatever, you have to actively swipe. So that is not something that I have been enjoying most of the time that it's existed, because you have to be so active about it. It's not something I can just put on and it switches to the next one. And that really bothers me because it means I have to actively be paying attention to it. I have to have my hands holding my phone so I can swipe to the next thing. And so it captures my attention for way longer. And I really don't like how that feels.
So looking at that through the lens of homesteading and acknowledging that pretty much any homesteading task is going to take a significant amount of time. It's not instant gratification in the sense that we're used to scrolling short form content on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. But, even these fast projects are things like greens. Greens are a really fast crop to grow. they're infamously quick, but even that takes like 60 days. Even that takes 2 months, and might take even more depending on how much sunlight you get. Or the reason that a lot of people choose Cornish cross to raise as meat birds is because they are so much faster and so much more efficient, because they're fast, than any of the other meat bird options. But even that is 6 weeks. It's still over a month. And so even these tasks that are, the homestead version of instant gratification take a lot of time.
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier, and I mentioned like I'm gonna do candles this year for the first time, making homemade candles. And even making candles is something where you want to wait a couple weeks to be able to use them. So even a small project like that, making candles, making soap, making vanilla extract, they're things you have to wait for, even though they're like simple processes and you're just, it's like a little thing that you're doing. It's not some crazy infrastructure project like all the other projects we're doing. Canning applesauce, which I'm about to be doing this next week. I have to get the apples, wash the apples, process the apples, put the apples in a roaster oven for a couple days until they're squishy, or on the stove, whatever you're using. And then I have to get my applesauce food mill out, mill them, add any sweetener or cinnamon or salt or anything I'm going to add, get them in the jars, and get them canned. And then after they're canned, I have to let them sit for 24 hours, check all the seals, take the rings off, wash all the jars again, label them after they dry, and then find somewhere on my shelf to put them. So even that one thing is such a process, and I really hope this doesn't sound like I'm complaining about it, because it's something I do because I really enjoy it and it's fun and it's a project that I like, but it is not instant gratification by any means. However, and this is kind of what I was saying earlier, where it feels like later on that you're getting instant gratification, because even though it's months in the making, because in 4 months from now, I can go to my shelf and pull a jar of homemade applesauce off the shelf, crack it open, and eat a whole jar of applesauce. And I know exactly what's in it and how it was made, and I know it's going to be absolutely delicious. So at that point, it feels like instant gratification, even though it's like months and hours of hands-on process in the making.
Yeah, and when you're looking at all of these projects, whether they're fast or slow, they all take so much time that, in my opinion, you really do have to fall in love with the process of it. Because if you spend a week processing and canning applesauce for the 5 minutes that it takes you to eat it, you're gonna get frustrated, you're gonna get tired, you're gonna start questioning, why am I doing this? And so you really do have to find those moments while you're in the process, while you are, the metaphor, you have to fall in love with climbing the mountain. If you're only doing it to get to the summit and you only have that brief moment of cool, and then you have to climb all the way back down, right? If you can't appreciate where you're at while you're doing it, it's gonna be real rough. I'm not gonna lie. And that's something that I've had to learn. That's something that I constantly have to remind myself when I am in the middle of being overwhelmed with all the tasks and projects that I've signed myself up for. That is entirely my doing, that I've done to myself. To take a step back in those frequent moments and say, like, you're here for a reason. You continue to choose to do this, and you've learned this lesson, but apparently you need to learn it a few more times over.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for like the cliche saying of like romanticizing your life, romanticizing like the little moments in your life where it's like, I'm not just ritualistic about my coffee in the morning. I also just go out in the garden when I'm about to feed the birds in the morning, and I'm like, wow, it's foggy out here. This is beautiful. I'm just going to stand here and like take deep breaths and enjoy it for a few seconds, even if it is just a few seconds. Like, you really have to be present in it. And as much as we're talking about like looking towards future goals and like working towards things that are far off in the distance, like also keeping yourself grounded in not only like the exact moment you're in, but why you got to that point or how you got to that point. Thinking about like, wow, I wanted this for so long. This was a huge goal. And like, now here I am. 2 years ago, there was just field here. And now there's a chicken coop and chickens, and appreciating how far you've come while also looking towards the goals that you still have that you're working towards.
Right. I think something that is always encouraging is looking back on the progress. I think I am equally as guilty as anybody else of you go out, you see your property every day, and when you see it that frequently, you don't notice the compoundment of those incremental changes. But if you have something like photos in your camera roll to look back on from last year and you go, actually, wow, yeah. my work has translated into a lot of changes that is significantly different than it was. That is also really encouraging, and that is also something that I tend to lean on in those moments.
Another thing that's really helped me with that, and it's also part of my just I like to keep track of things. I like making lists, is keeping track of details on like how much we have yielded with like the canning process, or how much we have in our freezer, like how much we saved preserved from this year. Being able to look back on those lists is not only like useful, but it's so beneficial to like boost your morale when you're like so frustrated with things, like in the middle of summer, when things haven't started producing yet, and I'm like, where are all of the tomatoes? Where are they? I need to start canning tomatoes. And then I look and I'm like, wow, I canned a lot of stuff last year from all of my homegrown tomatoes. And then a couple weeks goes by, and then I'm like bombarded by tomatoes, and I'm stressed out about how many tomatoes there are. And I'm like, okay, well, now I know what I need to do with all of these, because I looked back on what I did last year and I know what my goals are. Like, I set my goals ahead of time.
So when you think of your list of projects, your goals for your homestead, whether you started them or not, what are some of your longest term plans, the things that are going to take years to really start seeing the fruit from, seeing the rewards from?
Okay, biggest ones. We want to build a pole barn style garage situation for Taylor up in our current, it's like no man's land right now, but it's the old pasture. That's going to be a whole thing because it's like on the side of a hill, and we have to do a new driveway. We want to finish our basement, which requires digging around our entire house and trenching and waterproofing and redoing all the concrete. We want to build a small like goat barn situation / potting shed and like lawnmower, whatever, small tool storage. We have to do something with the kudzu field eventually. And that's probably going to be a matter of probably filling in a lot of the gorge that's over there, because it's just landfill. Like, it's literally just trash. And there's no way we'll be able to ever pull all of that out of there. Like, it's piles and piles and piles and piles of trash. And I really like the idea of maybe eventually turning some part of that area, because I never want to grow food over there, into some sort of like you pick flower situation for people to come by and pick their own flowers, because it's not something that they're eating, you know? And I guess a pond, probably. A little pond. Those are like all of our really big goals. There are a lot of others too, but those are going to be like years in the making. I know you're not sure what the future holds as far as staying on your homestead long term or not, but do you have future goals for the property that you're currently on, or potentially a new property in the future?
Yeah, so I guess to clarify, I'm not planning on moving. I don't want to freak anybody out. I just am open to whatever happens. I think one of the longest term projects is the sheep and breeding them. 2 years is a long time to wait for milk. And I hope it's only 2 years, right? Like maybe this spring won't work out and it'll end up being 3 for some reason, which, oh my gosh, knock on wood, right? We don't want that. That's probably one that I'm going to have to wait the longest for. And then I feel like fruit trees is the pretty classic example of that. I planted fruit trees the first year I was here, and I've gotten a total of 3 peaches and 1 nectarine as of this year, which was my 3rd growing season. So, you know, those things take time. And then another one that comes to mind is even just the soil in my garden. I opted to not spend a boatload of money on compost to get it started off the first year with everything. I am just improving it bit by bit as I can manage, and usually opting for the low-cost option to do so, which the trade-off is time. And the first year I was here, yeah, I grew things, but they were pretty pitiful. The second year, it was better. The third year, it was great. And I'm really excited to see what the 4th growing season looks like, because, it's just getting better.
That one makes me want to come back to my applesauce analogy from earlier. If we're thinking about, like, the long term of things, you said you've gotten, like, 3 peaches off of your fruit trees and that you're going into your 4th year on your property, right? I feel like I always need to take the chance to bring up community sufficiency wherever I can, because I think in this circumstance, like, if you rely on your community for people who already have established fruit trees, in particular apples, as my analogy goes, that allows for quicker gratification. I think even if it's not instant, it's a lot quicker than if you were trying to do everything completely on your own. So if you were to plant your apple trees when you first get to your property, and then you wait 5 years to get apples off of them, that's some long-awaited applesauce. Like, that's a really long wait for some applesauce, when you could plant the trees, invest in that resource for your own property and invest in that long-term gratification, but at the same time get a little bit of a reprieve from it by supporting somebody in your local community and buying apples from them.
Yeah, community has also been a topic that is heavily on my mind this week in a lot of different ways. I'm pretty decent at growing food, and no, I'm not perfect at it, and yeah, I'm always going to learn ways to get better, and I'm only going to get better at it. But I know a lot of people, even just on my road, who have tools and skills that I don't have, and that was on my mind actually yesterday. I was like, okay, so if I get sick of spending money, like, what can I barter with you for? Like, what's the trade conversion for cucumbers to lumber? I don't know, but it's something.
In that circumstance, it's a little bit different than going out and buying something from a veggie, like a farm stand or a local farm store or something, because there's like a transaction that's being had monetarily in my circumstance. But in your circumstance that you just pointed out, that's another interesting take, because that's also not very instant gratification. If you think about it, like, that is an investment in building a relationship with someone, where you're not like moving into your property and then expecting your neighbors to help you out with things when they don't even know you. So that's like a completely different kind of transaction and investment that you're making, and it's a time investment, just like a lot of these other things are, but it still has a lot of value in like a multitude of ways.
And it's still much faster than waiting for me to have the funds to buy a mill and learn how to do that.
Yeah, I keep waiting for somebody who lives by me to like watch one of our videos, like random person, neighbor. It's got to be like the the perfect certain circumstance where somebody who lives within like 20 minutes of me finds my YouTube channel and they also happen to have an excavator. And they're like, "Oh, do you need to use this? Let me bring it to you." Keep waiting for that to happen. But no, like in reality, that's never going to happen. It's like a hilarious thought. And I do think about that sometimes. I'm like, I wish somebody would just say, "Hey, or hey, do you want to use my excavator?"
I have had people email me and say, I'll come work for you for free, and I don't trust those people. So I say, no, I don't want you to know where I live.
I mean, yeah, there's that's the relationship aspect of like building community. And if it's some random person on the internet, maybe that takes a little bit more time to figure out a relationship if there will ever be a community relationship. And then there's me who like messages you on Instagram, and then like 2 years later, here we are. Friends, community.
Yeah, you never know.
But yeah, I mean, like sometimes if you have the money to invest in it, like sometimes buying the tool makes sense. Sometimes doing a DIY version is better, even if it is slower. We've mentioned this so many times. Like it's literally just a trade-off of time versus money. Again, we've used this example like multiple times at this point, but your beehive, that was a prime example of that. Like wanting to build it yourself. Or have Taylor help build it. A DIY version. But then the trade-off was the time, and you didn't want to take that time, and that's perfectly fine.
How about before you even saw your homestead, before you even bought your homestead, how long of a process was it to decide, one, that you wanted to homestead, and then two, realize what you wanted in homestead, and then three, get to the place where you could actually go get it?
So I feel like I fast-tracked this, to be completely honest. My desire to start growing food and getting back into gardening, like when it got rekindled, I would say, because as a child, like I always was interested in homestead life, but I didn't know what it was called at that point. Like I didn't know that was the term that I would think of. But 2020, I got interested in like gardening again. And by 2021, it was like mid 2020 that I got interested in gardening again. And then by that winter, I was buying seeds, planting my first garden at our friend's house. And then the following winter, we moved into our first house that we bought in Metro Detroit. Started the garden, got the garden going. And then we decided we wanted to move back to North Carolina or the Carolinas. Bought the camper, moved to South Carolina, then moved to North Carolina like 4 months later, 6 months later, and had our homestead. So it was like a 2.5-year process, I would say. A very, very quick timeline from watching gardening YouTube videos to where we were on our property where we plan to stay. And I think my goals have changed over the last couple of years, primarily because I started eating meat again. That has shifted a lot of things in my plans and kind of thrown everything. It's thrown a wrench into a lot of what I pictured to be here. And also just discovering our property and uncovering things on our property, that has also kind of changed our plans for what we initially thought, I would say, because the water flows differently, it lands differently, and that's a huge factor here. So there's a lot of change that's happened in that plan, I would say.
But you're 4.5 years into knowing that this is what you wanted, and still very much in the building phase.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we don't talk enough about as a homesteading community.
Yeah, and I mean, it really depends on where you start, because if you started this a little bit later on in life and you had more of a monetary ability, like a financial ability to purchase a homestead that's a little bit more set up or has some sort of infrastructure or doesn't have a house that's falling apart and full of mold like I did, that sets you up way quicker to be able to like start producing more to get quicker gratification with your projects. But we've had to split our money so many different ways that we haven't been able to pour into the infrastructure as much as somebody else might be able to. But yeah, I think either way, you're waiting at least like months for harvesting your first plants, your first produce from plants in the garden, if not years for whatever other projects you dream up.
My timeline looks very similar to yours, and even though it has taken us years, almost half a decade, to get to this point, you know, we're some of the lucky ones. We, through various ways and various leaps of faith, you know, we were able to get properties, and that's not a place that everybody is in. And I do feel extremely fortunate in that. And yes, I worked for it, but there are a lot of ways that I got lucky. And so that picture looks different for a lot of people. For some people, it's going to take a lot longer. For some people, that might not happen. But that also doesn't mean that you can't do those things like growing your food. And we have whole episodes about this of like, okay, you know, if that's just not where you're at, what can you do in an apartment? You can still can things. You can still, if all you have is a patio, you can build a container garden. You can do all of this stuff. It might look different, but it looks different for all of us. And so even if you're in a place where you're waiting for now, or you're in a place where you're making the best of where you're at, there are so many things that you can still do in those times.
I mean, like you said, we have episodes on how to do a lot of this stuff, or like touching briefly on a lot of these ideas. But if you're somebody who has like no clue where to start with this, or if you are somebody like me in the past week who's been kind of freaking out about things, I think next week we're going to talk about getting serious about growing your own food and how to do that in a very like realistic way, and especially on a small scale, because I think that's what a lot of people have to work with, and it's not feasible for them to move to a bigger scale with a drop of a hat. So I think that's going to be really important going forward, and I'm excited to talk about that next week. And I have one last thing that isn't necessarily just homestead related. It's more back to that social media aspect, but I thought it was an interesting viewpoint to add in here. I look at homesteading and filming my life in tandem with one another. The delayed process of homesteading makes filming my life and making interesting videos very difficult sometimes, because there's not always like this big reveal. There's not a conclusion at the end of every video. It's just that I ran out of light and my day ends, or sometimes the project ends and I get to say, yay, look at this, we did this. And that's something that I've become really aware of as our channel has grown, because we get comments from people saying, I love your show. And it really puts into perspective that like, this is my life. This is not a TV show. It will never be a grand finale every time. So I have to kind of, in those moments, like step back, and that's when I have to appreciate the little things of like the fog in the morning and my coffee and all of those little things that we've already talked about. Like appreciate cracking open a jar of applesauce that I preserved months earlier, because there's not always going to be that like grand reveal in life.
Right. I mean, it makes me think of planting garlic or direct sowing seeds or something, right? And you set your row out and you plant all your stuff, and it might take you hours, but it looks the same when you finish that it did when you started, right? It's still just bare dirt. And you're like, yay! But it's not the pretty satisfying picture of the full grown garden that maybe we're used to that sort of conclusion, especially when we're looking at social media and things. And maybe you are on top of it enough to go back in 3-6 months and record it, but imagine having to sit on that content for 3 to 6 months and keep it organized in order to have that kind of finale, right? It's not practical for what we make as content.
That's something, especially garlic, thinking about garlic. Those are the moments where it's like, I need to rely on some form of gratification to like make myself continue to be motivated. And a lot of the times for me, that's visual. I've mentioned that so many times in this episode. It's always visual motivation, visual gratification that really like keeps me going. But when I just like planted hundreds of cloves of garlic, or I've done a huge project and it's not something that's like super visually stimulating or exciting, I have to rely on the feeling. I'm like, okay, I got some exercise, I got a lot of fresh air, I know I did this, and I have to rely on like how I feel rather than the visual aspect of it. And that's really hard to convey via video.
What stands out in your mind for the projects that you've done so far that you've kind of reached that finish line? I know that might be, that might be kind of few and far between in terms of, at least compared to what you've started. But what's one thing that stands out in your mind that you crossed that finish line and you were like, oh my gosh, this feels so good. This was worth all of, the delayed gratification. This was worth all of the long-term investment.
These questions are always so hard because it's like I'm working on the garden and the house and the property like all at the same time. So I'm going to give you two answers. The house, it would be when I got the primer on all of the drywall after 2 years of working on it and waiting to like finish that, and a literal month of like grueling, painful drywall mudding. That was insane to see. And yeah, I have nothing else to say about other than like it was insane. I can't even describe one, how good it looked and how good it felt to know that I didn't have to drywall anymore. For the homestead things, the most accomplished I would say I've felt like that, wow, I did this feeling, is when we got our drone and we put it up in the sky and we're able to see like what our property looks like from above, knowing what it looked like via map view and old GIS maps previously. That blows my mind. That really puts into perspective how much we've changed this property. And I'm going to ask you the same thing.
I feel like I'm going to come up with a way better answer once we finish this, but the ones that come to mind, the ones that stand out to me are, the first one was the first meal that I was able to make with, I'll say all homestead food. The salt's not from the homestead, the oil's not from the homestead. Some of like a sprinkle of spices might not have been from the homestead, but the meat, the vegetables, all of those sorts of things, and even maybe some herbs and things here and there. The first meal that I sat down with, that I was like, I not only made this from scratch, but I grew this from scratch. And especially after waiting, years, knowing that that's what I wanted to do, but not being able to do it, finally getting here, and then pouring my literal blood, sweat, and tears into the garden, and then bumbling around figuring out how to do meat birds for the first time. That meal was a very long time in the making, and that is a feeling I don't think I'll ever be able to replicate. That first one that you get, that's pretty cool. That stands out in my mind. And the other one that comes to mind is last year. I can't remember. Oh, it all gets blurry. But at some point, I decided that I wanted to clear an area next to my pasture to expand the pasture, and I'm okay with it being more silvopasture, a little more wild. It doesn't need to be perfect manicured grass, no tree stumps, no anything. But I went into that not knowing how many of those trees I was going to be able to take out. For one, I had never touched a chainsaw before in my life. So, like, we're talking really starting from square one. And I cut down a heck of a lot of trees, and I did get some help from some family for a couple of them that I was like, I'm not touching that. There's no way. It's just not an intelligent choice. Seeing that get cleared, that was a cool feeling. Seeing grass actually start to grow there this year, because it's gotten better sunlight. The sheep have been able to keep it mowed back, all the brushy stuff. And I've thrown seed down. Watching that actually start to turn to what I wanted after a year and a half-ish. That's also a cool feeling. To be like, I am actually changing this landscape. Because I am here, things look different. That's cool.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.